I woke up to the sound of engines growling outside my window. My heart pounded as I threw off the covers and stumbled to my feet. The air inside my little ranch house was thick with dust and the scent of pine from the old wooden beams. I squinted through the window, and my stomach twisted into a knot. A fleet of black SUVs and pickup trucks had pulled up onto my property. Their headlights beamed through the darkness like eyes watching me. At first, I thought it was the police, maybe even the government. But then I saw them, dozens of them, dressed in matching polo shirts, clipboards in hand, and a smug arrogance dripping from their expressions. The HOA. I felt my blood go cold. I wasn't part of any HOA. My ranch sat on private land, far outside any neighborhood rules. But they weren't here for a friendly visit. The moment I stepped onto my porch, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a too-perfect smile strode up to me, flanked by two burly men. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice smooth yet threatening. "It's time we had a talk." Before I could answer, she held up a document, some sort of official-looking paper, and shoved it into my hands. "You're in violation of HOA regulations," she continued. "Your land was annexed into Oak Ridge Homeowners Association last month, and as a resident, you're now bound by our rules. Failure to comply will result in immediate fines, legal action, and possible seizure of your property." My grip on the paper tightened. This had to be a joke. I had spent my entire life savings buying this abandoned ranch. It was supposed to be my escape, a fresh start, away from city life and the insanity of HOA-run communities. Now, these people were standing in my front yard, claiming I had no choice but to join them. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. I never agreed to any HOA. This land was independent when I bought it. The woman's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. "That's where you're mistaken," she said. "A recent vote was passed by the surrounding community. Oak Ridge now extends to all properties in this sector, including yours. And that means you're one of us now." I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. No way. This wasn't happening. Then, as if on cue, the real nightmare began. Behind the woman, the other HOA members spread out across my land like a swarm of locusts. I watched in horror as they marked my fences with red paint, tagged my barn with inspection notices, and measured my house as if they were preparing for demolition. A deep, burning rage boiled inside me. They were acting like they already owned my home. I clenched my fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stood on my porch, fists clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. The night air was cool against my skin, but inside I was burning. The HOA woman, Mrs. Caldwell, according to her name tag, turned to her clipboard like she hadn't just threatened to tear my life apart. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I bought this ranch fair and square," I said through gritted teeth. "No one mentioned anything about an HOA when I signed the papers." She didn't even look up. "We don't need your permission. Oak Ridge HOA voted to absorb all properties on the west side of the valley. You fall within that boundary." I wanted to laugh. This was insane. Could a homeowners association just take over private land without asking? It didn't make sense. "You can't just force me to join," I snapped, stepping closer. "This is my property. I have rights." Mrs. Caldwell finally raised her head, her cold smile curling deeper. "Of course, Mr. Carter," she said, voice as smooth as poison. "But the law is on our side, and if you refuse to comply..." She tilted her head toward my barn. Two men in matching HOA shirts stood by the door, attaching a bright orange violation notice to the wood. "We'll make your life very uncomfortable." Uncomfortable? My jaw tightened. I'd heard horror stories about HOAs. Fines for leaving your grass too long. Rules about what color your door could be. But this was something else. I wanted to tell her to get off my land, to shove her little clipboard where the sun didn't shine. But then, I remembered how much I'd risked to be here. Every last cent of my savings had gone into buying and restoring this ranch. If they sued me, if they seized my land, I'd lose everything. Mrs. Caldwell must have sensed my hesitation because her smile widened. "We'll be in touch," she said, snapping her folder shut. "Have a pleasant evening, Mr. Carter." With that, she turned on her heel and strutted toward her SUV. One by one, The other HOA members filed back into their vehicles, leaving behind a mess of red tags and warning signs across my property. I stood there long after their engines faded into the night, my blood boiling. They thought I'd roll over and obey. They were wrong. The next morning, I got to work. I spent hours tearing down every violation notice, scrubbing the red paint off my fence posts, and double-checking my property records. There had to be a loophole. By noon, I was buried in paperwork, old deeds, sale agreements, anything I could find. My hands were shaking from frustration when I finally spotted it. A map, a detailed county survey from 50 years ago, showing exactly where my ranch's boundaries lay. My heart pounded as I traced the lines with my finger. I wasn't within the HOA's legal boundary, at least not entirely. A sliver of my east fence brushed against the edge of Oak Ridge's expanded zone, but the majority of my land? Totally independent. Mrs. Caldwell had lied. I slammed the folder shut, breathing hard. I had them, or at least I thought I did. By sunset, I was feeling pretty good, until I heard the rumble of another engine outside. I stepped onto the porch just in time to see a tow truck rolling on my driveway. My stomach dropped when I spotted what it was dragging behind it, an HOA storage container. The driver, a wiry man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, hopped out and slapped a clipboard into my chest. "Sign here," he grunted. I stared at him. "What is this?" "Compliance package," he said, as if that explained anything. "Mandatory. Oak Ridge HOA orders." I didn't sign a thing, but it didn't matter. He unhooked the container right there on my driveway and left, kicking up a cloud of dust as he peeled off. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a nightmare in plastic. They'd sent me pre-approved paint for my barn, a standard-issue mailbox, and a 300-page rulebook thicker than a brick. And on top of it all, a bill for $5,000 in initial compliance fees. My hand shook as I crumpled the paper. This wasn't just about making me join. They wanted to break me. But if Mrs. Caldwell thought she could bully me off my land, she was about to learn a hard lesson. I wasn't going down without a fight. The sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across my ranch. I stood in my driveway, staring at the HOA's so-called compliance package. My blood boiled hotter with every second. This wasn't just about joining their ridiculous homeowners club. They wanted control. And from the size of that bill, they wanted my money too. I wasn't about to give them either. I grabbed the invoice, stormed inside, and slammed the door behind me. My boots thudded against the wooden floor as I dropped the HOA's paperwork on my kitchen table. The faded map of my property still lay open next to my laptop. That old boundary line, the one that proved most of my land was outside their reach, it had to be my way out. I needed answers, fast. I fired up the laptop and started digging. First stop, the county property records. I spent hours clicking through dusty legal archives until my eyes burned. And then, buried under pages of legal jargon, I found something that made my heart stop. A document dated 3 months ago. Amendment to Oak Ridge HOA boundaries, approved by County Zoning Commission. I scanned the page. The HOA had expanded their reach to include dozens of properties, including mine. But something was off. The signatures, one of the names listed wasn't just familiar. It was suspicious. Margaret Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Why would the head of the HOA push to annex abandoned land like mine? Or was she really after? I needed someone who knew how these people operated, someone local. The next morning, I drove into town. Rust Creek wasn't much, a couple of dusty shops, an old diner, and a gas station where the pumps still beeped like it was the 1980s. But everyone here knew everyone, and rumors traveled fast. I found what I was looking for inside the diner. "Hey, Ed," I said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Ed was in his 60s, a wiry man with sun-weathered skin and a permanent scowl. He'd been around long before Oak Ridge, HOA, came to town. If anyone had dirt on them, it was him. He wiped his hands on a towel and raised an eyebrow. "Carter, heard the HOA's breathing down your neck. So, already know. Hard not to," he muttered. "They've been swallowing up land all over the valley. Guess you're next on the menu." I pushed the map toward him. "This says most of my ranch is outside their boundary. How are they getting away with this?" Ed squinted at the paper, then let out a dry laugh. Ain't about rules with those vultures. It's about what's under the land. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? He lowered his voice. You ever hear about the mineral rights around here? I blinked. Mineral rights? Ed leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Years back, a survey found natural gas deposits under these hills. Big money. But here's the kicker. Only property owners have the right to lease that gas. HOA can't touch it unless you're a member. I felt my heart slam against my ribs. That's why they wanted my ranch. If they forced me into the HOA, they'd control the mineral rights, and any profit from the gas beneath my land would go straight into their pockets. And I was the last holdout standing in their way. I drove home with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. My mind spun with what I'd learned. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about fences, paint colors, or mailboxes. It was about money, millions of dollars. When I pulled up at my ranch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. They had been here again. The HOA's bright orange violation signs littered my property more than before. My barn was covered in them. My front gate was padlocked with a heavy-duty chain. And the worst part? A stop work order nailed to my porch, ordering me to cease all renovations. I tore the sign down and crumpled in my fist. They want to fight? Fine. They were about to get one. That night, I barely slept. My mind churned with anger and a plan began to form. A way to strike back. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, I'd play dirtier. At dawn, I grabbed my phone and made a call. Hey, it's Carter. I need your help. My friend Mark was a lawyer, not the fancy corporate kind, but the kind who'd fought enough land disputes to know every loophole in the book. If anyone could help me unravel this mess, it was him. By noon, he was sitting at my kitchen table, scanning the same map I'd pored over. They've overstepped, he said, shaking his head. Even with that boundary amendment, most of your property is outside their jurisdiction. We can fight this. And the mineral rights? I asked. He smiled. If you're not part of the HOA, they can't touch them. And if we prove they're acting outside their authority, they lose everything. I finished, feeling a surge of hope. Mark nodded. But you need to be careful. These people are powerful. They won't back down easily. I stood up, a fierce determination settling in my chest. Let them try, I said. This is my land. I'm not giving it up. As Mark gathered his papers, I watched the sun set over the hills. I knew the HOA wasn't finished with me. Not by a long shot. But they made a mistake. They came after the wrong man. I woke up the next morning to the sound of metal grinding against metal. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming, until a loud bang shook the front of the house. I bolted out of bed, yanked on my boots, and rushed outside. My heart slammed against my ribs when I saw a bulldozer rumbling toward my front fence. And standing beside it, clipboard in hand, was Mrs. Caldwell. What the hell do you think you're doing? I shouted, storming toward them. Mrs. Caldwell barely flinched. Good morning, Mr. Carter, she said, her voice sickly sweet. Your fence is in violation of Oak Ridge's aesthetic guidelines. It needs to come down. I stepped in front of the bulldozer, my fists clenched. This is an HOA property. You have no right to touch my land. She smiled, a cold, thin thing that made my stomach twist. Actually, Mr. Carter, under our amended guidelines, any non-compliant structures within our expansion zone are subject to immediate removal. I felt my blood boil. You're trespassing. Call the sheriff if you'd like, she said, shrugging. But by the time they arrive, your fence will be gone. The driver revved the engine. Dirt and dust swirled around me. They were serious. And just like that, I realized something chilling. This was a warning. They could have started with a fine, but they wanted to send a message. Comply, or we'll destroy everything you've built. But they didn't know who they were messing with. You touch that fence, I said, stepping closer, and I'll sue you so hard the only thing left of your HOA will be a pile of paperwork. Her smile slipped. For the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes, doubt. I held her gaze and added, I spoke to a lawyer. I know the truth about the mineral rights under this land. That's why you want me gone, isn't it? The bulldozer's engine sputtered into silence. Mrs. Caldwell's face paled, just for a second, but it was enough. You're making a mistake, she hissed before turning on her heel and marching back to her SUV. The bulldozer reversed, rumbling back toward the road. I didn't move until the dust settled and the sound of their engines faded. They blinked first, but I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I double-checked the locks on every door and window. If they wanted a war, I was ready. I pulled out my phone and dialed Mark. "They tried to bulldoze my fence today," I said the second he picked up. He let out a low whistle. "They're getting desperate. They know about the mineral rights," I said. "We need to hit them before they try something worse." I heard him shuffle papers in the background. I've been digging deeper. Turns out, the HOA's expansion isn't as ironclad as they claim. There's a public hearing coming up next week. If we prove they acted outside their authority, we can shut this whole thing down. "Perfect," I said, feeling hope surge through me. "But be careful," Mark warned. "When HOAs feel threatened, they play dirty. They won't stop until they get what they want." I found out just how dirty they could play the next morning. I woke to a sharp knock on my door. When I opened it, my stomach twisted. A county inspector stood on my porch, clipboard in hand. "Morning," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Got a report of unauthorized livestock on the property." I blinked. "Livestock?" He pointed toward my pasture. "Neighbor filed a complaint. Says you're keeping unregistered animals out there. HOA regulations require all livestock be reported and approved." My head spun. I don't even have livestock. The inspector didn't care. Failure to comply could result in fines up to $10,000 or legal seizure of property assets. I bit back a curse. This wasn't about animals. This was harassment, plain and simple. And it was working. If I missed even one of these bogus violations, they could bury me in fines until I had no choice but to sell. I forced myself to stay calm. "I'll take care of it," I said, my voice tight. The inspector handed me a warning notice, tipped his hat, and left. I stood there, the paper crumpling in my fist. They were trying to break me, but I wasn't backing down. That evening, I took a walk around my property. The sun dipped low across the hills, casting gold over the wild grass. I'd poured everything I had into this place. I wasn't going to let a bunch of greedy HOA bullies steal it from me. I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures of every fake violation notice they'd left. If they wanted a war, I'd document every dirty move they made. But as I reached the edge of my land, I noticed something strange. A white SUV was parked just beyond my fence, engine idling. My chest tightened. I crept closer, staying low behind a line of trees. When I peeked through the branches, my blood ran cold. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the driver's seat, talking to someone on the phone. I couldn't hear her words, but I caught something in her hand, a map. A map with my property circled in bold red ink. My gut twisted. They weren't just harassing me. They were planning something bigger. I slipped back toward the house, heart pounding in my chest. I needed to stay ahead of them, because if I didn't, the HOA wouldn't stop until they took everything from me. And I wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, I woke up to an uneasy silence, the kind that settled right before something bad happened. I couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Caldwell's SUV parked near my fence. That map with my property circled in red burned into my mind. If the HOA wanted to push me off my land, there had to be a reason. I grabbed my coffee and stepped outside. The crisp morning air did little to cool my rising anger. My fence was still standing, for now. But the stop work orders, the fake violations, and the unannounced visits weren't just harassment. They were testing me. And I was done playing defense. I needed to know exactly what they were after, and the answer was beneath my feet. By noon, I was at the county records office. The place smelled like old paper and desperation, but it held the one thing the HOA couldn't hide, the truth. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, barely glanced up when I approached. "I need property surveys and mineral rights documentation for parcel 46A, I said, sliding a note with my ranch's plot number across the counter. She sighed, pushed her glasses up her nose, and disappeared into the back. Minutes stretched into an hour before she returned with a thick file marked restricted access. My pulse quickened. "You found something," I said. She frowned. "I shouldn't be giving you this. But let's just say you're not the first person the HOAs tried to push around." I took the file and found an empty table in the corner. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through faded maps and legal documents until I found it. A geological survey from 20 years ago. Buried beneath my land was a vast natural gas deposit, enough to make someone filthy rich. But here's the twist. The HOA doesn't own the mineral rights. The original property deed, signed in 1957, clearly separated surface rights from subsurface mineral rights. Unless I voluntarily joined the HOA, they couldn't touch the gas. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. I finally had proof. The HOA didn't want me to join because they cared about community standards. They wanted me under their control because I was sitting on a fortune and they couldn't touch a dime of it. I snapped a picture of the survey and texted it to Mark, my lawyer. Within seconds, my phone buzzed. Mark, this is huge. We can bury them with this. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I could actually win. But that hope shattered the second I pulled back into my driveway. My ranch was swarming with strangers. A dozen men in neon vests and hard hats were already tearing down my fence. I slammed the brakes and jumped out of my truck. Hey, I bellowed. Get off my property. One of the workers, a burly guy with a clipboard, barely looked up. Orders from the HOA, sir, he said. This fence is in violation. Comes down today. I spotted Mrs. Caldwell, standing smugly near the bulldozer. She was wearing her usual crisp suit, but today her smile was colder. You're trespassing, I snapped, storming toward her. We're ensuring compliance, she said, tilting her head. And since you refused to join, we're escalating enforcement measures. I pull my phone from my pocket. I've got county records that prove this land is outside your jurisdiction. And if you so much as touch my property again, I'll take you to court and make sure you lose everything. Her face twitched just for a second, but then she stepped closer, lowering her voice. You don't understand, Mr. Carter, she said, her tone icy. This isn't just about rules. It's about power. People like you don't belong here. My fist clenched. I'm not scared of you. You should be, she whispered. The bulldozer revved its engine. My heart pounded as I watched the blade dig into my fence post. Splinters of wood flew through the air. I had to stop this now. I hit record on my phone. You're trespassing on private property and illegally destroying my fence. I'm documenting everything. Mrs. Caldwell's expression darkened. You think your little videos will stop us? I smirked. No, but the county judge will. Her mouth twisted into a snarl. But before she could respond, a familiar black truck roared up the driveway. Mark. He slammed his door shut and held up a thick stack of papers. I have a cease and desist order, he announced. And if you don't stop this destruction immediately, you'll be in violation of state property laws. Mrs. Caldwell's face went pale. You can't. I can. Mark cut her off, his voice like steel. And I'll make sure you personally pay for the damages. The workers hesitated, looking back and forth. The bulldozer's engine sputtered into silence. Mrs. Caldwell's mask slipped entirely. Hatred burned behind her eyes. This isn't over, she hissed before spinning on her heel and storming off. I exhaled a shaky breath as the last of her workers packed up and left. Mark clapped a hand on my shoulder. They're scared, he said, and scared people make mistakes. I nodded, my heart still pounding. They won't stop, Mark. Not until they get what's under my land. Then we make sure they never do, he said, holding up the paperwork. This is just the beginning. That night, I stood at the edge of my property, watching the stars flicker over the dark hills. The HOA wanted my ranch, and they were willing to destroy me to get it. But they underestimated me. I wasn't backing down, and with Mark by my side, I was ready to fight. Whatever it took. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old ranch house made my stomach twist, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA wasn't done with me yet. By dawn, I was back on my porch with a cup of coffee, scanning the edges of my property. My fence was still battered from their little stunt yesterday, but it was standing. For now, a familiar black truck rolled up my driveway, kicking dust into the golden morning light. Mark stepped out, his face tense as he held a thick manila folder. You're up early, I said, trying to sound casual. You're going to want to hear this, he replied, handing me the folder. I flipped it open, and what I saw stopped me cold. Inside were pages of financial records, specifically the Oak Ridge HOA's records. and buried within the piles of numbers was something that made my blood run cold. "They're in deep trouble," Mark said. "The HOA's finances are a mess. For the past 2 years, they've been funneling money into a special project." I scanned the documents, heart pounding. "A project for land development?" He nodded grimly. "They want to buy out as much property as possible and sell it to a major energy corporation." The pieces fell into place like a sledgehammer to my chest. That's why they were after me. If they could bully me into joining the HOA, they'd gain control over the mineral rights and cash in on the natural gas fortune beneath my land. "They need you gone," Mark said, his voice low. "And if you don't join willingly, they'll break you until you have no choice." I clenched my fists, fury burning in my gut. Not going to happen. But Mark wasn't done. "It's worse than that," he said, flipping to the next page. "If they can't force you to join, they might try to take your land through eminent domain." I froze. "You're joking." "I wish," he said grimly. "They've got friends on the county council. If they convince the board that your land is necessary for community development, they could seize it." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. This wasn't just some petty neighborhood dispute. This was war, and I was running out of time. Later that day, I was back on my property, reinforcing my battered fence. Every hammer strike echoed my determination. I wasn't giving up. But as the sun dipped low, something caught my eye. A drone. It hovered just beyond my property line, a sleek black thing with blinking red lights. My stomach twisted. They were watching me. Without thinking, I grabbed a rock and hurled it. The drone jerked sideways and spun out of sight. But the message was clear. They weren't done. And neither was I. By nightfall, I had a plan. If the HOA want to play dirty, I'd fight back twice as hard. I spent the next day digging through public records, searching for anything that could tie their special project to illegal activity. I knew the HOA was hiding something. I just had to find it. And then, just past midnight, I struck gold. Buried deep in the archives was a confidential contract between the Oak Ridge HOA and Blue Peak Energy, a major gas corporation. The terms were simple. If the HOA delivered full mineral rights over the area, Blue Peak would pay them millions. But there was one catch. The contract was illegal. Under state law, an HOA can't force independent landowners into a membership or seize property without clear community benefit. And Blue Peak? They were relying on the HOA to bend the rules for them. I printed every page and sent copies to Mark. The next time the HOA tried to mess with me, I'd be ready. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, I woke up to find a demolition notice nailed to my front gate. My stomach dropped. According to the letter, my barn was unsafe and marked for immediate removal. They were trying to tear down part of my ranch, and they didn't even bother to hide it. I ripped the notice down and called Mark. "They're trying to demolish my barn," I said through gritted teeth. "I'll handle it," he promised. "But Carter, they're getting bold. Watch your back." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with everything that had happened. The fake violations, the drone, the demolition notice. I needed to protect my land, no matter what it took. I grabbed a flashlight and made a full loop around my property. Everything seemed quiet until I reached the back pasture. That's when I saw it. A hole, freshly dug, right near my fence line. I knelt down, shining my light into the dirt, and my blood turned to ice. Someone had drilled a small shaft straight down, deep enough to sample the natural gas below. The HOA wasn't just watching me. They were already trying to steal what was mine. I swallowed hard and pulled out my phone. "Mark," I said, my voice shaking, "they've gone too far. We're not playing defense anymore," he replied. "It's time to take the fight to them." I stood there in the dark, fists clenched, as the wind rustled through the trees. If the HOA wanted a war, they'd just cross the line. And I was about to strike back harder than they ever imagined. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was that drilled hole, proof that the HOA wasn't just harassing me. They were stealing from me. By sunrise, I was done playing defense. If the HOA wanted a war, I was bringing it straight to their doorstep. I called Mark the second his office opened. "We need to hit them where it hurts," I said, pacing my porch. He didn't hesitate. "I'm filing an injunction to block any further demolition or drilling. But we need more. Something that'll make them back off permanently." I already knew what he meant. Evidence. If we could prove the HOA was working with Blue Peak Energy to violate the law, we could destroy their entire operation. And I had an idea exactly where to start. By noon, I was parked outside the HOA office. A boring brick building that looked as soulless as the people who ran it. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to dig up their dirtiest secrets. I stepped inside, plastering on a fake smile. "Morning," I said to the receptionist. "I'd like to review the HOA bylaws and board meeting minutes. Just want to stay informed." She barely glanced up. "Records are public. Give me a minute." Bingo. Minutes later, I was sitting at a dusty table with 2 binders marked private, board records. My fingers trembled with excitement as I flipped through page after page of mundane notes until I hit gold. A meeting transcript from 4 months ago. If we secure the Carter property, Blue Peak guarantees a 7-figure payout. My heart pounded. There it was. Clear proof that the HOA wasn't enforcing rules. They were running a scam. But that wasn't the worst part. The next page held a confidential memo from Mrs. Caldwell herself. If Carter won't comply, explore alternative measures to acquire the land discreetly. Alternative measures. I didn't like the sound of that. I snapped photos of everything, stuffing my phone back into my pocket. This was more than enough to bury them. But just as I was leaving, I heard something that stopped me cold. From the office down the hall, Mrs. Caldwell's sharp voice drifted out. "Is the survey team in place? I want results by the end of the week. That gas deposit is ours, with or without his permission." Rage boiled under my skin. They weren't backing down, and neither was I. That night, I called Mark. "About everything we need," I said, sending him the photos. When he saw the memo, he whistled low. "This isn't just HOA overreach," he said. "This is a full-blown criminal conspiracy. And with this evidence, we're taking them down." The next morning, Mark filed a lawsuit against the HOA for trespassing, harassment, and conspiracy to commit theft. It wasn't just a legal move, it was a declaration of war. And the HOA knew it. By noon, a black SUV rolled up my driveway. Mrs. Caldwell stepped out, her lips curled into a cold smile. "You think a lawsuit scares me?" she sneered, striding toward me. "We have resources you can't imagine." I folded my arms. "I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," she said softly. "You're standing in the way of something much bigger than yourself. But if you withdraw the lawsuit, we could make things easier." My blood boiled. They were trying to buy me off. "I'm not selling. And I'm not backing down," I said, my voice hard. Her smile vanished. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said, stepping closer. "The mistake was thinking you could bully me. And when this is over, I'm bringing your whole empire crashing down." Her eyes flashed with rage, but she said nothing. She just turned and slid back in her SUV. As she drove off, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting to destroy the people who thought they could take it. And I was just getting started. I knew the HOA wouldn't go down without a fight. What I didn't expect was how far they were willing to go. The day after I filed the lawsuit, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop, metal grinding against wood. I bolted out the door and froze. A crew of workers in bright orange vests was tearing down my fence. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, storming toward them. One of the men barely glanced up. "HOA orders," he grunted. "Your fence violates neighborhood standards. It's got to come down." Rage surged through me. "This isn't even HOA property." "Not my problem," he said, yanking out another post. I spun around and spotted Mrs. Caldwell, standing at the edge of my property with her arms crossed and a smug smile plastered across her face. "You can't do this," I yelled. "Oh, but we can," she said sweetly. Page 46, subsection C of the revised HOA bylaws. "We have the authority to enforce community appearance standards, whether you're a member or not." My vision blurred with rage. "This is illegal." "Then sue us again," she said, flashing her perfect teeth. "Good luck paying those legal fees." I clenched my fists, heart pounding in my ears. This wasn't just about the fence. They were trying to break me. And I knew if I didn't stop them, they wouldn't stop until they took everything. I spent the rest of the day rebuilding my fence by hand. Every post I hammered back into the ground only fueled my determination. I wasn't backing down. By nightfall, I was exhausted, but the fence stood tall again. It felt like a small victory until I checked my mailbox. Inside was a certified letter from the county zoning office. My heart sank as I ripped it open. It was a cease and desist order. According to the letter, the barn on my property was in violation of zoning regulations, and if I didn't demolish it within 30 days, the county would do it for me. My hand shook. This wasn't a coincidence. The HOA was pulling strings behind the scenes, and now they were using the local government against me. I needed a plan, and fast. The next morning, I met with Mark in his office. He skimmed through the cease and desist letter, his brow furrowed in frustration. "This is dirty, even for them," he said. "But there's a loophole. If we can prove the barn is a historical structure, it's protected under state law." "Historical?" I echoed. "It's just an old barn." Mark leaned forward. "Maybe, but if you can find any historical significance, anything at all, we can stop the demolition." It was a long shot, but right now, it was all I had. I spent the next 2 days combing through county archives and old newspapers, anything that might give me a shred of evidence. I was exhausted, my eyes burning from hours of scrolling through faded documents. And then, I found it. An article from 1932. Local ranch becomes shelter for Dust Bowl refugees. My heart pounded as I read on. According to the report, my barn had once served as a relief shelter during the Great Depression, offering food and housing to displaced families. If I could prove the barn was a historical site, the HOA wouldn't just lose their ability to tear it down, they'd lose their grip on my land entirely. Armed with my new evidence, Mark filed a motion to protect my barn under historical preservation laws. If the court sided with us, the HOA's entire scheme would fall apart. But the HOA? They weren't done playing dirty. A few days later, I came home from running errands and immediately felt that something was off. The air smelled wrong, burning. I sprinted toward the barn, only to see smoke curling from the back corner. My stomach dropped. Someone had set my barn on fire. I grabbed a hose, my hands shaking as I sprayed the flames, but it wasn't enough. The fire spread too fast, licking up the wooden beams, turning my hard work to ashes. By the time the fire department arrived, the barn was gone, and standing at the edge of the road, watching the whole thing, was Mrs. Caldwell. When our eyes met, she smiled. I sat on my porch late that night, staring at the blackened wreckage. My throat burned with anger. They didn't just want my land. They wanted to break me. And now, I was out of patience. At dawn, I sent Mark every shred of evidence I had, the meeting minutes, the Blue Peak contract, the illegal drilling. "This isn't just civil anymore," I told him. "We're going after them for criminal conspiracy." He didn't argue. "I'll take it to the state attorney's office. If we're lucky, they'll open a criminal investigation." I wasn't leaving things to luck. If the HOA wanted to destroy my life, I was about to destroy theirs. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air as I stood before the ruins of my barn. The HOA had crossed the line, and they thought they'd won. They were wrong, because while they played dirty, I was about to play smarter. I spent the next morning gathering every piece of evidence I had. Photos of the illegal drilling, the HOA board minutes, the memo where Mrs. Caldwell ordered alternative measures. By noon, I had compiled a complete dossier, enough to make even the boldest HOA president sweat. But I wasn't stopping there. I uploaded everything to a public website titled HOA Corruption Exposed: How They're Stealing Private Property. Then, I sent the link to every local news station, city council member, and, just for fun, the HOA board's personal inboxes. They wanted a fight? I was taking it public. It didn't take long for the fireworks to start. Within hours, the story blew up. HOA accused of illegal drilling and property theft. Reporters called nonstop, eager to interview the crazy rancher who refused to back down. By evening, my driveway was packed with news vans. I stood on my porch, microphone in hand, as the cameras rolled. "This isn't about rules or regulations," I said, my voice firm. "This is about greed. The HOA is working with a private energy company to steal land from hardworking people, and I have the proof." I held up the confidential memo, letting the camera zoom in on Mrs. Caldwell's signature. They burned my barn, I said, my hands trembling with rage. But they can't burn the truth. And I won't stop until they pay for every dirty trick. The crowd erupted in murmurs, and one of the reporters turned to the camera. This could be the beginning of the biggest HOA corruption scandal this town has ever seen. Good. Let the world see exactly who they were. The next day, things got even better. Mark called, his voice practically vibrating with excitement. The state attorney's office is opening a criminal investigation into the HOA. I nearly dropped the phone. You're serious? Dead serious, he said. Your evidence was airtight. And that memo? It's a smoking gun. If Caldwell's guilty, and she's going down. I laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. After everything they'd put me through, the law was finally on my side. But the HOA? They weren't done yet. 2 days later, I woke up to something new. An eviction notice. My stomach twisted as I read the bold letters. According to the document, my property was now annexed under HOA jurisdiction. And because I refused to pay dues, they claimed they had the right to foreclose on my home. They were trying to kick me out. I clenched my fists so tightly my knuckles burned. Not a chance. I stormed into the county courthouse later that day, slamming the eviction notice onto the clerk's desk. This is illegal, I snapped. I never agreed to join the HOA. The clerk frowned, flipping through the paperwork. You're right, she said, but there's a catch. If a majority of the HOA board votes to annex your property, it can happen without your consent. I felt cold all over. They rewrote the rules just to destroy me. I wasn't leaving my fate to a piece of paper. I was fighting back. The next HOA meeting was packed. Reporters, neighbors, even city officials curious about the growing scandal. Mrs. Caldwell stood at the podium, her face pale but her voice as sharp as ever. Mr. Carter has refused to comply with community standards, she announced. We have every legal right to enforce membership. And that's a lie, I said, rising from my seat. And you know it. I marched to the front and held up the confidential memo for the entire crowd to see. You didn't annex my land to enforce community standards. You did it to steal millions from a private drilling deal. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I wasn't done. And let's not forget, you burned my barn to cover up the illegal pipeline. I turned to face the city council members. Are you really going to let these crooks steal my home? For once, Mrs. Caldwell had nothing to say. After the meeting, things moved fast. The county suspended the HOA's authority pending the criminal investigation. The cease and desist order? Revoked. And Mrs. Caldwell? She was arrested for conspiracy and arson. But the best part? The judge issued a permanent injunction, blocking the HOA from ever touching my land again. I stood on my porch the day they hauled her away in handcuffs, breathing in the sweet scent of freedom. They tried to break me. They failed. And now, I owned every inch of this ranch, free and clear. The sun rose over my ranch, casting golden light across the blackened remains of my barn. The air still held the faint scent of smoke, a reminder of how far the HOA had gone to destroy me. But today, I was delivering the final blow. The morning buzzed with energy. News crews set up cameras along the road, while neighbors gathered on my property, whispering about the arrest of Mrs. Caldwell and the criminal investigation unfolding against the HOA. And right in the middle of it all, I stood tall. Mark arrived just after 9, his face stretched into a victorious grin. We did it, he said, handing me an official court document. I scanned the words, my heart pounding with satisfaction. Permanent injunction. The HOA could never touch my land again. But that wasn't all. The court also ordered a full audit of the HOA's financials. Every shady dollar, every backroom deal was about to be exposed. And Mrs. Caldwell? She wasn't just facing civil penalties. Thanks to the evidence Mark provided, she was now charged with arson, conspiracy, and criminal property damage. She wouldn't be running a neighborhood again. Ever. By noon, the local sheriff's office arrived with a moving truck. This time, it wasn't for me. It was for the HOA headquarters. I watched, arms crossed, as officers seized file cabinets, computers, and years' worth of confidential records. Every shady contract and backdoor bribe was now evidence. And the best part? I made sure the media had front row seats. Later that day, the HOA board held a final emergency meeting, but this time I wasn't on the defensive. I stood at the podium, my voice clear and steady as I made one final demand. I'm filing a motion to dissolve this HOA permanently, I announced. The room erupted in gasps. Even the remaining board members paled. You can't do that, one of them sputtered. I can. And I did, I said, holding up the legal filing. When an HOA engages in criminal acts, the court can dismantle it. And after everything you've done, this neighborhood will be better off without you. It took 3 more months of legal battles, but in the end, I won. The HOA was officially dissolved, their assets seized to repay the residents they had wronged. Every illegal fee, every penny stolen, returned. And the land the HOA had tried so hard to take from me, mine, forever. On the day the court order became final, I stood at the edge of my property, watching as the last of the HOA's office furniture was loaded into a truck. Mrs. Caldwell had resigned in disgrace, her mugshot plastered across the news. The rest of the board scattered, hoping to avoid the fallout. And me? I wasn't just the guy who saved my ranch. I was the guy who took down a corrupt HOA. That night, as the stars spread across the sky, I walked back to where my barn once stood. The place they'd burned to the ground to break me. But they hadn't. And soon, I'd rebuild bigger and better. Because now, there was no HOA left to stop me. I risked everything on this ranch. And in the end, I took it all back.